and your privacy is protected by using the webinar format, which prevents others from seeing your video or hearing your audio connection. It will be recorded and posted on YouTube channel at a later date. So hopefully you could also share it with your friends and family. In keeping with the webinar format, only the panelists and the presenter will be live on screen. So we ask you to submit your questions via the Q&A and chat function. If you are watching this on social media, you may submit your questions via their chat functions on the various channels. With the webinar format, only the panelists. So let us start our presentation with a short introduction to the topic and to the International School of the Golden Rosycross. The School of the Golden Rosycross is an international organization. The school is represented online by social media on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as having its own online magazine, Logon Media. You will see the web pages up on the screen now, which if you would like, take a picture or a screen capture, so you have that as a reference for a later date. If you want to keep in contact with the public work activities worldwide, please visit the Golden Rosycross community website on www.goldenrosycross.org. They have public work activities in 4 time zones in English-speaking world. If you wish to find out more about their activities on the Australian website, please visit www.goldenrosycross.org.au. If you would like to email us, please use the email provided on the contact page. Thanks, and we'll now hand over to the presenter for this webinar on meditation. We welcome all those now joining on social media to this webinar of the Golden Rosycross.
Well, dear friends, as Nairi explained, we are an international school. So, you know, I'm an international participant in this Australian webinar. So thanks for the invitation. I'm a pupil of the school, and I am from another country, as you can tell already, right? So, you know, since English is not my mother language, I'll do my best to try to be understood. But later on during the questions, if eventually something that I said was not totally clear, I think we can come back to that with your questions, and with you know, all the other panelists, we can try to address that. Please also feel free to submit your questions during this presentation in the Q&A chat box. We'll try to answer all of them, and after we have this introduction, when we go to the second part of this presentation, that is to try to address your questions. That is really the most important and most interesting part, we hope. Well, anyhow, a word about the school. As Nairi said, yes, we are an international school, you know, present in more than 40 countries in all the continents, with approximately, you know, 15,000 pupils and members around the globe. And, you know, this is really something important, because we call ourselves in the school pupils. Nobody's a master in the school. We have the founders of the school, of course, and we have a lot of respect for them. But, you know, today, all the participants of the school, we call ourselves pupils. And this is really important because, you know, embedded in that idea, we have 2 main aspects. Number 1, a pupil is a person that has the commitment to learn, from the beginning to the end of her or his life. And second, because nobody is going to call herself or himself a master, ever. Because we, as Rosicrucians, we recognize that there is only one master in the entire universe, and that master is the spirit. The spirit is not a person, is not somebody that died and lost the physical body, and now the consciousness is projected in the more subtle energetic bodies. The spirit is the main pillar, the main ideation pillar of the entire universe, is the central idea that moves matter, that creates everything. The spirit is the omnipresent center of everything that exists. And so the spirit is also the center of our true being, the center of each one of us. And that is the master. So we are pupils to that master, pupils of that master. And it is that inner real master that should be teaching us the path of transmutation. That path of transmutation is embedded in the idea of golden rosycross. Golden, of course, comes from gold, and gold here is, an indication of the alchemical symbol of the transmutation of the metals. We know that alchemy is an allegory, is a symbol, and that those metals and substances that need to be transmuted, they refer to the different aspects of our psyche, of our consciousness, and of our vehicles, both physical and subtle ones. And gold is really the particle of the spirit, is the substance of the spirit that can transmute the silver of the soul, the mercury of the thought, the copper of the thinking, the iron of the will, and so on, into gradually more subtle substances, up to the point that everything becomes permeated by gold. And that golden rosycross is really the attempt to put the spirit, this particle of gold, the spirit spark, in the very utmost center of each one of us, in the center of everything, to allow for a transmutation of the consciousness and of life. And that is the meaning of the word Rosycross for us. Of course, we could allude to the historical heritage, which is marvelous and very deep and very broad, but at the same time, Rosycross for us is something very close, very real, is the capacity of uniting the two dimensions of life, the spiritual dimension of life, that is the rose, that is the spirit spark, that in the beginning could be compared to a rosebud, but that can flourish, that can really blossom in our hearts. And when it blossoms, right, in the very center of our cross, the cross of our personality, that is formed by what we think, what we feel, what we desire, and what we do, then the human being can unite the spiritual and the human dimension of life and become a rosy cross, become someone that has united the rose of the spirit and the cross of human life. So that's the meaning of this name. And actually, that's the proposal of this path. And based upon this proposal that uses as the pillars of work, like tools, the different aspects of the universal teachings, is that we approach those aspects of the universal teachings to try to understand, the real depth of each one of them, and also the meaning of those pillars in our lives. So the teachings, the universal teachings that are, the perennial doctrine that belongs to all cultures of all times, all continents, all peoples, They form this marvelous heritage that points to, with different symbols and different words, but always to the same meaning, the meaning that the human being can transform herself or himself. So, for example, those themes are the ones that we deal with in these public talks. And the public talk of today talks about a very important one. One aspect of the universal teachings that is very close to countless human beings today, that we would like to dive into, and to unveil some of the, let's say, inner meanings and inner possibilities of work and transformation. And that's exactly with that spirit and that perspective that we would like to address the theme about meditation. And after we talk a little bit about meditation, we would like to take one step further into the real meaning of meditation from the standpoint of the spiritual school and of the universal teachings. That is the awakening of the higher mind, or the manifestation of a totally new state of consciousness, a new state of consciousness that can really unleash a totally new set of possibilities of manifestation of a new life. Okay, so let's move on. The first aspect that we would like to touch upon is the meaning of the word meditation. As we know, meditation comes from a Latin root, and that Latin root is meditare, right? Meditare is also the root of medium, or the medium or the center of things. So meditation or meditare actually means the act of being united to your center in the middle of your being. And that's why we have, this nice picture of this young lady that is looking at her heart and discovering that in her heart, there is the principle of an entire new universe. And when we talked about the spirit spark, or the spiritual principle, in the very heart, in the very core of the human heart, or the center of this cell of the universe that we live in, that is the microcosm, that's what we meant. I mean, the center is not outside. The center is within. Closer, as the Christian tradition would say, closer than hand and feet. And in the moment that we realize that the true meaning of meditation is not a state of mind that we can achieve every now and then when we are in a special condition, but meditation means the possibility of living all the time united with that core, and to drive all the aspects, not only of our minds, but of our feelings, of our perceptions, of our actions based upon that center. Then we believe in the spiritual school that we are really approaching the true, eventually the hidden meaning of meditation. So, taking one step further now, we often hear, texts or testimonials of a special state of mind, the state of mind that is achieved during meditation, or in a state of meditation, or on a meditative attitude. We would like to call that state as a contemplative mind. In other words, a mind that is able to see reality, to perceive reality without judgment, or without tainting reality by its own colors, by its own impressions. a mind that is able to objectively perceive reality without the prism or without, the distortions that are natural to our current state of consciousness, that in the spiritual school we call the identified state of consciousness or the egocentric state of consciousness, because it is related to the connection between the ego, its shadows, and the mind itself. Well, science explains to us, and this comes from one of those scientific sites that talk about the way that the mind works. That we have basically 5 categories of brain waves. And if you measure them in hertz, right, or if you measure them in vibration, the faster ones are normally associated with thinking. So when you look at this chart, the gamma and beta ones are related to the mental performance of the mind, problem solving, some reactions of fear, the fact the awakened mind, mental activity, concentration, etc. And when you gradually start to go down the table, this table, and look at other waves that are slower in vibration, right? Then you start to see more relaxed states. When you look at alpha, for example, relaxed moments, when you are approaching or getting out of sleep. Also a very receptive state of mind, open to learning or open to be influenced by external impressions. And also when you're accessing memory and recording memory, right? And the other ones, theta it's pretty much, the frontier between, being asleep and being awakened. It's that borderline, and at the same time, create, open to images, to intuition, and not necessarily to structured logical thought. And then the deeper one, which is delta, is just deep sleep, right? Well, what happens with, what normally happens with all the attempts to take our normal mind, that, as we said, normal mind normally operates in those 2 higher brain waves, right? The attempt to meditate normally try to take that level of awareness, that mind, and make it function for a certain period of time into lower frequencies, but not being asleep, being totally awakened, but at the same time with a different pattern of vibration. This is what explains that those contemplative states tend to, practically disconnect the thoughts, or at least we see the thoughts or the thought circle from the outside. And we migrate, or we go as if we could, isolate ourselves from that circle and be more centered in a more silent space where we can perceive things in a different way. So, scientifically speaking, that's what happens. And that's why, the pattern shifts normally from thoughts to images, to intuition, to perception, right? And this is what explains this temporary shift of pattern. Why do we insist on saying temporary? Because truly, this is what takes place. This temporary shift of perception is because we try to take what in esoteric terms, what in according to the universal teachings, what we normally call the lower mind, or the mind associated with feelings, or associated with astral energies, and we try to raise that mind temporarily to another state, as if that mind could operate as the higher mind that is still not manifested in us. Well, friends, there's a saying from a wise from China. His name is Lao Tzu. Certainly many of you have heard about him and read about him. He's one of the founders or one of the main thinkers of the Taoism or the Taoism, that teaches, this unity of the Tao, and this unity that should be achieved by overcoming the separateness of the egocentric consciousness. And he talks about, when we try to raise ourselves to that higher state from below, in other words, using the lower mind or the kama manas, as they say in the East, right? What happens is, as if we were like this person trying to raise the level of consciousness to a higher state, as if we were on the tip of our toes. That's what Lao Tzu mentions in one of his texts. He says that when we try to do that, it is as if we stood on the tip of our toes. And why does he say that? Because yes, we can stay in that higher state for some moments. It varies from one person to another. And it's really important and really inspiring, because it can, give us a glimpse of a different perception, of a different reality. But it's only a glimpse. Why? Because the natural pattern of the egocentric mind that is absolutely identified and associated with the thought patterns of the egocentric consciousness, that will take place. It will take control again of the mind. And as Lao Tzu says, sooner or later, our heels will come back to the ground and our mind will be back to the normal functioning as it was before. That's why those oscillations, getting in and out of a meditation state or a contemplative state, can be really inspirational, but they cannot be permanent. And what happens is that, even if we train our minds to stay in that state as long as we can, there is not a fundamental change in our state of being. And, that is the secret that the universal teaching tries to tell us, tries to teach us. That there is a different reality, there's a different level of consciousness that should take place, that should manifest itself within us, so that the meditative state, the contemplative state, would no longer be an oscillation of consciousness from one given level into the other and coming back to the, let's say, to the dominant state of consciousness, that is the lower manas or the egocentric mind, but instead that we could really live permanently in a different state of perception. Not that the previous state of mind disappears, but it is integrated into a totally different state of consciousness. A state of consciousness that manifests the higher mind, and the higher mind actually encompasses, it envelops, it includes the other mind into this state, so that all the perceptions, all the thoughts or the feelings, they are anchored not anymore in this eccentric circle of perceptions of the egocentric consciousness, but they are based upon and they are part of a totally new state of consciousness. So, talking about this new state of consciousness, this higher perception, this higher mind, we'd like to tackle it using three main ideas that are normally associated with the higher mind or the functioning of the higher mind. When we talk about enlightenment, when we talk about those that really achieved that higher state of consciousness, we normally tend to think of words like silence, of a different state of mind, of some sort of power that was used or that was available for them to transform themselves. And we like to use those words to try to make a difference of the perception that we normally carry about this state and what the universal teaching tells us about the fundamentals of that new state. And to understand the difference sometimes is a little bit of a nuance, but subtle, but it's really, really fundamental and important because it can drive us in one way or a totally different way, to make us go closer to that or eventually keep on going in circles. So with silence, we like to say that this real silence, this real space of silence that already exists in us, but most of us, we are not aware of it. This silence is not absence of noise. And especially here, and here we have a lady, not only covering her ears, but it seems that she's trying to, tear apart the noise that is circulating inside of her head. So this silence is not absence of external noise, and above all, of inner noise. So achieving silence, or the real basis, or the real being for us to participate in this state of a higher consciousness, of a higher mind, is not to take a part of your thoughts and classify them and say that this is good for this process and this is bad for this process, and to try to take out strength and power from one group to give it to another one, as if we were judging bad noise and good noise, or different versions of ourselves, or different versions of our thoughts. Because if we try to reach silence with that, actually what we are doing is we are, starting a massive mental war with ourselves. A very strongly judgmental war inside of our minds, saying that this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. Because friends, that duality doesn't exist in the universe. The universe is not made of right and wrong. The universe is made of polarity. And polarity actually is the manifestation of the one single universal force. So the duality exists only inside of us. And if we try to reach unity by fighting with polarity, we'll not go very far. So silence is something else. So how could we describe silence? We've used an image that we hope it can help a little bit. It is as if we had the entire universe with all the manifestation. So that's a picture of the galaxies outside of us, right? But if we could map our thoughts inside of our mind, they would look like those clusters of, celestial bodies, right? Certain groups of ideas that circulate inside of our minds, etc. And sometimes we try to dominate the thoughts with other thoughts, with more powerful ideas, with a good direction for the mind, And actually, if we do that, we are fighting on the same plane, on the same level, even if that level is three-dimensional or even multi-dimensional. Actually, silence is not that. Silence is what is behind, what is inside, what is beyond. In this picture here, silence is as if it was the drawing board of everything that is manifested, of that universe, of the outside universe and the inner universe. So silence is space, space where everything manifests itself. And space is much more vast than the entire universe. Even if you include here dark matter, dark energy, and everything that we still cannot see or measure. And that external, immense, incommensurable dimension is also applicable to the inner universe. We are also made of this silence. That silence is our true being. It is as if this silence is the sea of eternity, and our consciousness is a drop that manifests itself out of it. But it has forgotten itself about it. And it fights only at the level of the drop. But the entire sea is still there. But we need to learn, we need to see, we need to perceive. And this is what, it's so fundamental about the universal teaching. When a pupil begins the path, the pupil is not told to dive in silence. The pupil is told to pay attention to the noise, because the mind doesn't see its own noise, and it lives in the illusion that it is one thought or another thought, but it needs to gain a different level of freedom, and that freedom can only stem from true, real self-knowledge, and not by having thoughts fighting other thoughts. And that's why the next image that really talks about the mind, talks about the thoughts, etc., it's a very known picture, a very nice one, by the way, that shows our minds as labyrinths. And if we could look into our minds in many, many different instances, it would look like that, isn't it? I mean, a labyrinth of thoughts, an immense labyrinth. And in that labyrinth, as we can see here in this nice picture, we have different thoughts, different groups of thoughts, competing thoughts, fighting thoughts, that in essence are projections, images of the individual who is thinking. And, this is also a very nice way to see how identified we are with our own thoughts. By the way, I'm just using a very identified expression, calling thoughts as my thoughts, my own thoughts. Look at this. There is a central thought in the labyrinth, but this thought circulates. Maybe this thought says or alludes to attachment to a situation, to a person, to a relationship, to a profession, to a nation, to whatever. And the ego, the person, or the consciousness defines herself or himself by that thought. So that thought could be the name. So if I ask you, who are you? You reply to me your name. If I say, this is just a name, then you come back with your nationality. I say, this is just the country where you were born. And so we go on, and then you come with your profession. No, this is just your profession. You could change your profession just the way you change your name, And those things actually are used as, fulcrum points, where the consciousness tries to find support, tries to find a point to move on. But actually, they're just thoughts. And in the moment that we understand that and that we pay attention to that, really pay attention to that, we pay attention to the noise, we start to see how identified, how glued we are to those shadows, to those aspects of ourselves that are projections of ourselves that we call ourselves, but we are not that. And the same way that we are not those shadows, we are not those thoughts, our mind is really not that collective set of thoughts, that labyrinth of thoughts. The real mind is the one in us that sees, that perceives, is the true eye of the soul, is the true silent observer. But the problem is that the higher mind, the real one that sees, that perceives, that realizes things inside of us, is not aware of itself. Why? Because it's absolutely attached. It's absolutely identified with all of its shadows. Shadows that thoughts that, she or he created by themselves, or eventually that we imported from other people, or that we learned through the media. It doesn't matter. In the moment that they belong or that they become part of this set of thoughts in our minds, we appropriate ourselves from them. We start to call them as parts of our ego, as parts of our I, and we move on. But, the product of self-observation and self-knowledge is to really detach that, is to really allow the silent observer to become aware of itself and to realize that the circle of thoughts, the noise, and by the way, friends, this circle of noise is just like the river of life. It flows. You cannot stop them. You should not stop them. The real liberation is not stopping the thoughts. It's not producing artificial silence in our minds, because that is the equivalent of, stopping the river of life. It flows. It has to flow. But it is as if we were outside of the river, observing the river and seeing that river from the higher standpoint of the higher mind that is not in the river of the lower mind. And that is the birth, the appearance of the real fulcrum, of the real center of our true awareness, of our consciousness, that in essence is an emanation of the all, an emanation of the real being that we are part of. So, now that we talked a little bit about the two main components, the real being, silence, and the center of the consciousness, that is the seed of the higher mind, that is already in us, that is the silent observer. We would like to talk a little bit about the power that can unleash, that can unlock the possibility of this transformation, of the manifestation of this higher state of consciousness in us. What kind of power is that? Certainly, is not the power or the will of self, of the egocentric consciousness. So this means that this path is not accessible to the will of the self, to the will of the ego. So whatever the will is able to do or to drive or to point in a certain direction, it is not the direction of this path. And this, for us, is certainly very disconcerting, because we are trained since we are babies, right, to do things, which is great, because we should do things in life. But what happens here is that when we are put in front of the gate of the inner path, we react the same way. And we ask, what should I do? See, what kind of thoughts can I use as an identified mind to fight another state that is not desirable, to produce a different way? So what kind of noise should fight the other noise to produce silence? See, we don't go very far if we go that way. So that's why normally all sorts of practices, of exercises or training that we can do with our self, our lower self, our egocentric self, is not a path that is able to lead us to the higher self. And that's why we have all those symbols of those apparent paradoxes. And for example, the Zen culture and the Zen teachings are so filled with those paradoxes, right? So for you to achieve something, you have to do the opposite. That's also the real meaning of the Wu Wei, of that idea from the Eastern Chinese teachings that tells you about a non-doing, a non-willing. It's not that you're going to become a passive being and allow life to go on its own way, just the opposite, or to become indifferent to other people. No, absolutely not. But it is to understand that there is a different will. There is a different self already in us. So it is to recognize that point. And when we recognize that point, the real power that can transform us, that can manifest a higher mind, and from a higher mind, a totally different new life, is the power of the spirit spark. So here we come back to the very beginning of this conversation tonight. So the spirit spark that is right here in the middle, right? In the utmost core of our being is the only true power that can unleash this new possibility. And many people, many seekers, they ask, what can I do to awaken this power? What can I do to make the spirit active in me? What can I do to really have the spirit as the driving force of my life? And that is a very important, but at the same time, a very tricky question, because it hides, in its midst, a very important secret. Just like we said before, that the inner path, for the pupil, that is at the very beginning, the first step on this eternal path. The universal teaching does not ask her or him to silence the mind, but to pay attention to the noise. When the seekers ask, what should I do to awaken the spirit spark in me? It's also a tricky thing, because the person that asks that is already awakened by the spirit. Because nobody would ask that question if the mind was operating totally in the lower schemes of the old labyrinth of the mind. Because the mind then would be totally at ease, even if in its conflicts and even in its problems, but it would be totally at ease with the invisible mechanisms of identification between the consciousness and the thoughts. The person would be just like that person sitting at the very end of Plato's cave, looking at the cave wall and firmly believing that those moving shadows are actually the manifestation of reality. So the person that after countless experiences in this life or in previous lives of the eternal being that is the circle of fire, the microcosm, the person that through those countless experiences has come to a level of maturity to become aware of the crazy delusion that we live in. That is the delusion of the shadows of the I, the shadows of the egocentric mind, at the very end of the cave of the inner world, as if the wall of the cave was here, our front heads, right? And our brains keep on projecting shadows on the front of it. So the person that becomes, saturated of that, absolutely filled with those experiences, that person will become just like a ripe fruit. And the ripe fruit, when it disconnects itself from the tree of delusion of the I and hits the hard ground of reality, it opens up and the seed inside of it becomes active. This is the seed. This is the spirit seed, the spirit spark. And when it becomes active, it doesn't give peace. It doesn't give comfort. It doesn't give, enlightenment. Just the opposite. It gives a disquieting feeling. A feeling of totally uneasiness in front of life, where this person looks at the world and says, no, this doesn't make total sense. It's impossible for me to find sense in this life only by chasing the egocentric objectives of my being, of myself. It is as if this spirit spark had awakened the consciousness to the fact that the moving objects that she or he sees at the very end of the cave, the very, last wall of the cave, is not reality, it's just a projection, it's just a shadow of something else. And when the person starts to ask that question, that person becomes a seeker of the truth, and she or he will never be able again to become satisfied only with the labyrinth of thoughts or desires or reactions inside of the head, the heart, or even in life itself. So it is this disquieting, feeling or situation that pushes the person to become a seeker of the truth. So it's not a matter of awakening the spirit. The spirit has already awakened you. And the real question, the question that determines, our entire lives, is what we do with this burning fire that we have in our hearts. If we try to solve that within the boundaries of the life of the egocentric consciousness, we may find some comfort here or there, but again, we are putting ourselves at the tip of our toes. And reality normally and forcibly reconciles itself with us. And we go back to the previous state of being. What needs to take place is an entire self-revolution. And this entire self-revolution, based upon the power of the spirit spark that has awakened us, when the consciousness really dives in and with a non-biased self-observation gains the freedom of self-knowledge, that is the path that in its pure form can manifest true meditation. Because in its pure form, true meditation could be defined as the awakening of this new consciousness by the spirit spark. It is as if the spirit spark became the center of this inner awareness in us. And this inner awareness in us could be awakened and understand that behind this entire inner universe of manifestation, there already lies the true being, the true silent space, the real manifestation of the divine universe in us. Dear friends, with that, we conclude this first part by saying that, this path that we try to describe is actually the path of all the spiritual schools of the past, regardless of the symbols that were used, the language that was spoken, the way that it was written, or even if it was, an oral tradition. And it's also the path that the spiritual school of the Golden Rosycross tries to follow. And the effort to follow that path is the effort of every pupil of every spiritual school. The effort that should be able to translate that spirit spark that here is represented by this center, this point at the very middle of the sphere, that transforms the consciousness made by our hearts, our heads, and our hands. In other words, our lives. And when around the center of the spirit spark, a new consciousness, the higher mind, manifests itself, then the square of our personality, the square of our current existence, that is made by the lower mind or the concrete thought, the astral manifestation or the emotional body with its chakras and everything else, the vital energy or the etheric body, and even the physical form. All those aspects are just like, included, enveloped, totally surrounded by this new state of consciousness and alchemically transformed, like the four elements of nature that are transmuted by the particle of gold and the new triangle of the consciousness. And that is really the manifestation of the eternal life that is symbolized by the eternal circle that has no beginning and no end. We truly hope that these elements that we have shared with you in this presentation, had some use to you in your own path. And now we'd like to give the word back to our moderator, who will then open up, the second part of the presentation, where all the panelists of this webinar will try to address with different perspectives and different points of views the question that might have arisen during this first part. Thank you very much for your kindness and your patience for such a long presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Neto, for sharing those thoughts with us and for explaining from the basis of the school of the Golden Rosycross how we can practice in our daily lives the meditation from the soul. We have quite a few questions already have come through the chat box or from the Q&A. So I'd like to now just start so we can push on with them. The first one, I'd like to ask, Juan would like to ask, is the master that you mentioned at the start also known in other cultures and religions as the innermost or the inner being? And Neville, if you would like to give your perspective on that answer, please.
Yes, hi Juan. In a word, yes, it is. As you would have got from Neto's talk, we're called to become the disciple of our own soul, which is the master within each of us. So yeah, that's what the path of the school is about, is to give our life to that inner spark, to give our life to that inner knowing, to that inner yearning, and really learn to listen to that inner voice and let it guide us in our spiritual walk, in our spiritual process of realizing that other state of being that is available in that silence. So yes, it is.
Milos, would you like to add anything to that explanation?
Maybe not to add, since we have a lot of other questions, and then maybe we can tie in with some other question.
Sure, sure. Okay, so we'll move on to the question from Te Amakura. She makes the note that this is not stopping the thoughts, but rather it is separating from them. Perhaps Mari Rose, would you like to unmute? Yep.
I can continue. I will take this one.
Okay.
Since I passed. To use Neto's analogy of the river, a river of life, or a river of our thoughts, we could start building a dam in a river to control the water, thinking that we are controlling our parts or our thoughts, or to create certain path, but we can also step out of the water and observe those thoughts. In a sense, what was the, can you repeat the question to see what else was said there?
It's not stopping the thoughts, but is it separating from them?
Correct. Yes, it's as Neto mentioned, and we quite often use the example of detachment. Or to use the word, it's not what we own, but what owns us. Because if we got attached with certain things, then we don't have ownership of that. We are owned, so to speak. And we want to be detached in order to be observant, to see what is really going on, and not to be identified with the thoughts or with any other aspect in our life, profession, or any other role.
And another thing to also keep in mind is, as those thoughts are presenting themselves to us, we are just kind of neutrally observing them without identifying or without even suppressing it, just seeing it flow by and understanding that this is not us, those thoughts are not us, and we're not identifying to it, but we are recognizing them. And by recognizing those thoughts, we're neutralizing them. That's, in a way, separating from them.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so another question we have here is, if I simply observe my mind right now in this moment, am I truly in touch with my higher mind? I thought only the activated spirit can awaken the higher mind. So, Neville, have you a thought on that?
The inner divine spark in us is the source of the yearning we feel, and that is what calls us to shift our focus to this. So when we surrender to that is the activated spirit that is trying to awaken the higher mind. In fact, it is the higher mind. Yeah. So our own will, our own inner drive and yearning is part of this equation. It's not just waiting for something outside of ourselves to bring it about. It's up to us to listen to that inner impulse and that inner drive where we can't settle with things of the world, and something else, some other source within us is calling out for our attention, and that is the activated spirit. It's alive and well within us, and it wants to reach out through all of our sort of false identifications, because it's who we really are, and it wants to come alive inside of us. And so it is the activated spirit that awakens the higher mind through us. I hope that makes sense.
Netto, would you like to add anything to that? It's quite a complex question, so.
No, I think, I wouldn't add anything to what Neville said. I think that in the moment that we don't expect that to come from outside of us, but that we realize that this yearning is already the driving force of the spirit within us, in the very beginning is very complex and very disconcerting, because we believe that we are observing our minds, but in the moment that we say, I'm observing my mind, that's already a thought. And that thought has already pulled me back into the river, as Neville and Milos were saying. So the real manifestation of the spirit is to give, increasing levels of awareness and of liberty to the consciousness, up to the point that the center of the consciousness is the spirit itself, and everything else is phenomena. So that's why, for example, in the teachings of the school, first we talk about, a new consciousness, a consciousness that awakens, is awakened from inside out, and is able to perceive itself functioning most of the times. But, this consciousness is partly, old and partly new, because every now and then it mixes itself again with phenomena. But there is a level of awareness and self-perception that, is different from this one. And that's what, in the old traditions, like in Egypt, like in Christianity, etc., we had all those characters in this narrative, right? Actually, they were not different people. As Neville was saying, it's not something that happens outside of us, but inside of us. So when we realize that, we see that those different levels of consciousness are leading us to a point where the center of the consciousness is the spirit. That's why the school talks about a spirit soul as the unfolding of the manifestation of a new consciousness.
Right.
Now, can I just add quickly the real incredible importance in this path of self-observation, of knowing ourself, by stepping outside of that river and just observing the flow of thoughts, by really stepping back and observing all of our reactions and responses. That is so crucial in this path, because that steps us out of ego identification of all kinds and into being the observer, which is one small step away from the spirit spark. It's totally resonant with our spiritual consciousness.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to a question from Maxine. Could silence be looked at as an authentic connection between thought and emotion, or between brainwave and heartwave? Perhaps Andrew, would you like to start with this question?
It would be very hard to say that, because the scientists say, the two brain hemispheres that we've got, the left side is connected with getting us to the moon, and the other is the intuitive thing that we have, the right-hand side. But we've been discussing the spirit spark atom in our heart, and it must start, of course, from our heart, because that's where the spirit spark atom is. So unless you start from that spirit spark atom, you're usually in the left-hand side of your your brain or your head, your lower mind. Just I'd like to comment on the lady before. She asked about all the thoughts inside of us. 50 years ago, when I was sort of young, my mother used to always draw my attention, and she was an old Scottish lady, of course, and she always said, "Laddie, your head's full of wee beasties." And the wee beasties are the thoughts, you know, but I was never aware of the thoughts until she pointed them out. So she could have been my first teacher in Know Thyself, you know, because if you don't observe the little beasties in your head, where are you? You know, you're all in sort of lower mind. But what school tells us that, you know, after purifying our hearts and our minds, we start from that emotional or that feeling that's in our heart. It goes to the head. So as Neville said, you know, we have to know ourselves. If we don't know ourselves, we're under the rule of the little beasties.
Mhm.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we have a question from Amy, who wants to know, how does awakening the higher mind relate to my intuition? Perhaps Mari Rose, would you like to answer?
Well, I can take a crack at it, and then maybe someone else can kind of add to it. Well, the intuition is an interesting thing. It's actually the better route to connecting with the innermost self, because intuition is kind of apart from your mental, from using your actual reasoning intelligence. And that's really what we need when we're trying to reach that innermost spark that's within us, because it's not something that we can reason into. In the contrary, the heart is the one who will bring the head into where it's supposed to get to as we go in this path. So I would say intuition is a route, is helpful as you're trying to connect with that innermost self, because it has nothing to do with the mind, which oversee and try to overtake everything. So in that sense, I would say it's a route that's helpful to do that process. It's a good start.
I think that intuition really is one of the keys actually that we should rely on. Not the instinct, but the intuition that comes from the different source. And we are trying to emphasize the heart, and that a heart sanctuary, but also the balance between the head and the heart, which we most often don't have. And that's one of the also key points to balance or to reestablish the connection between the head and the heart, or as we say, to think with the heart.
Could I add something on intuition too?
Certainly.
Okay. Intuition is a very deep word, and sometimes we use that word to describe different phenomena inside of ourselves. When people normally ask about intuition, one angle that we try to help the person see is, what kind of intuition are you talking about? Because basically there are two types of intuition, and both poles or both sides of our mind, the dormant one, that is the higher mind that needs to be awakened, and the lower mind that is very active in us, they both react to intuition. Why? Because intuition is something that is normally beyond the capacity of thinking. And, on the aspect of the higher mind, intuition is, the thought image that is so high, so powerful, that sees everything from above and understands that all the different aspects, all the different angles of a situation are actually part of the same picture. So that intuition, that it normally comes in a flash, right, is really that, flash of the higher mind that positions our understanding above the dualities that we create with our thoughts. So that aspect is really something very powerful and precise. But there is another pole of intuition that we need to be very aware of, is the intuition that stems from the astral life, that also circulates in the heart. The heart also has to liberate itself, not from a circle of thoughts, but a circle of a very chaotic emotional life that also fills the heart, right? So when those circles or those waves of emotions that are normally the basis of the identified thought, because those emotions are like behind the identified thought in terms of this is good and this is bad, because feels good or feels bad. Normally it comes before the thought. And sometimes we can rationalize those dualities, but sometimes they are so fast and so powerful that even our thinking cannot understand what is taking place. And underneath, as if an undercurrent, there is this astral life that also imprisons us and attaches us to all the identifications that we talked before. So that intuition is actually an emotional attachment that later on is rationalized and translated into something else. So that intuition is a part of the mechanism that, closes this loop of self-imprisonment even stronger, okay? And that is the intuition that comes through the astral body, through the lower mind. So this is not the intuition of the higher mind that Mary Rose and Milos were talking about, and that we think that even you were alluding to. But as we move into our path, it's important to really gain perspective about those different things that we normally give sometimes the same name, but they are different. Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so that actually leads on to another question that's come in from Rhonda, who is asking about what is polarity in respect to polarity versus duality. So anyone would like to answer? It's a key point in the school, so it's yeah.
Well, to me, polarity is a natural oscillation in universal energy, but duality is what the ego mind will make of it, of judging good and bad, right and wrong, and creating this trap of opposites that we get caught up in, and try and be one and avoid the other, or favor one and reject the other. And so it causes a great stress and a tension in our, and a contraction in our consciousness.
I would maybe add that our world exists based on the polarity, otherwise we will not exist. Our electricity, in order to work, needs polarity, positive and negative. And I like to use examples from Nikola Tesla, but I would rather refer people to do research there about the electromagnetic field, that we have our own electromagnetic field of the planet. And basically without polarity, this realm would not exist.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that the as Neville said, that the polarity is a natural phenomenon, And it's only our egocentric or judgmental perspective that puts the dualist terminologies on those conditions. So we say it's good, someone else says the same thing is bad because of their personal perspective. So we live, everybody lives in their own different dualistic realm because they have their own expressions of what is good and bad, right and wrong, happy, sad. And it's actually just labeling a natural phenomenon. Yeah.
And that's why the soul, one of the attributes of the soul is to see things as they really are, and there's no need to label. You know, it's like there's no naming function happening in the mind. It's just a clear, open perception.
So talking about that perception, someone has asked via YouTube, what is listening to the inner voice? So, Andrew, would you like to help us with that answer?
From observation, it's being in the world, but not of it. And it's hard to explain with words. You've got to be in that state. So I can't explain it from my lower mind. You know, you can only explain it when you're in that state of being.
Netta, would you like to add a little to that?
I could more or less along the same lines of what Andrew just said. You know, listening to the inner voice is something that is very puzzling, because we normally tend to think that the inner voice is a very soothing voice that you know, puts everything in place and calms things down and makes us peaceful and balanced, etc. No, the inner voice brings storm. The inner voice brings unmasking of our delusions. That's why, for example, you know, in the Christian tradition, and every time that the school quotes the Christian tradition, it's not from a historical or religious perspective, but as an inner narrative, right? It's like, you know, the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching would be, you know. So in this inner narrative, this inner voice, when it is asked from the other aspects of the consciousness, because we are all living that in our inner world, it is asked, what have you come to do here in my inner world? And this consciousness replies, I didn't come here to bring peace, the sword. In other words, first of all, it to show everything in us that is out of place, that is attachment, that is a shadow, it's a projection. So listening to the inner voice is actually being constantly unmasked about who we believe we are, but that we are not. So it's you know, really the opposite of what it might look like.
If I may add, just in one of the services we were mentioning that the silence is also the food for the soul, or the original prana, or the gnosis, or the root fire, which means it's not the emptiness, but it's actually presence of something else.
And the inner voice is also the one that's able to move away from the duality and just see the polarity, and with that have a clearer idea of what's in front, what we are dealing with.
So it's like we're not going after peace or tranquility. We have to see things as they are, like it's as Arjuna and Krishna were about to fight the battle. And Arjuna, Krishna represents the spirit, and Arjuna, you know, is like us. And he refused to fight. He said, no, 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 no. This battlefield, they're all my relatives, these are, etc., you know. But he'd forgotten that Krishna represented the spirit. You know, so we sort of go from one to the other. We have all the theories, but we're in this world, so, you know, but we don't have to be of it, you know, in this battle, as Neto said, because it is a struggle sometimes. But we're detached from that. We can't lose, actually. You know, but it takes the spirit to remind us sometimes. And, you know, in a younger age, I practiced meditation, you know, and meditation in those days was simply using your attention. In other words, taking the attention from the mind, from the thoughts, and putting it on a mantra or the breath or something like that. And you did become tranquil, but you came back to the battlefield, you know, after 20 or 30 minutes of meditation, you were back in this world. And it was, you know, so it's not a way, you know, it would be all right if we could have that, you know, we could be detached from this world, but we can't. We're in it, but we can see it. We can see the play of consciousness. It's just a massive play of consciousness, and we can see that sometimes.
Thanks, Andrew.
Just quick, I was referring to, recently we were talking about the voice of the silence from Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, which I was trying to refer to that inner voice, that our inner voice is the voice of the silence.
That inner voice is also the person or the being that knows us well. We can't hide behind that. Whether we think that you're one way or the other, that inner voice knows best what we really are. There's no hiding behind pretense, because it's like we're out in the open, where whichever way we go, that inner voice knows exactly. There's no pretending. So it kind of keeps us honest, so to speak.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question, which comes from Jack. What can I do to awaken or live in this state of the observing soul? Perhaps Tanya, would you like to try and attempt that one?
First of all, you have to really long for it. You really will have to become aware of a deep yearning in yourself, that you want to free yourself from yourself, out of the mere experience that whatever you have applied until now in this world didn't bring you where you really wanted to get. That you try to free yourself from the one shackle, and by doing so you found out that you just change yourself to another shackle. And only because of that pure experience, that whatever you do, you were never getting out of your own circle, that yearning, that roots, that can root and it can raise from that experience. That's the only way that you can learn to step beyond yourself to that realm of the soul. And wanting to observe yourself, how it came about, you were constantly imprisoning yourself. So I would say just go on with experiencing what you do, because that's the only way to lead you to such a deep yearning for freedom that it will eventually bring you to self-knowledge, which is so important, to step away from yourself inwardly. And there's no wrongdoing in that. It's only experience. I hope this helps.
What you said, Tanya, reminded me of a sentence, a quote that is attributed to Lao Tzu, and I think it's fantastic because it's the essence of what you said. He says, "Act without expectation." That means that in the moment that we are so dedicated to do what is necessary without expecting any result, good or bad, liberating or not, but we are just there observing at the service of reality, then this action without expectation becomes a liberating action in that very moment. What you said just reminded me of that sentence.
Yeah. The problem is that we very often don't even understand that we are yearning for liberation. We just go, we are urged forward by something in us that's that fiery spark that doesn't know where to go with itself, so to speak. So it urges us to do something, and we go here and there, we search all planets, the depth of the oceans. It's not there. It's not there. But because you're so tied, so entangled with your own urges to seek, you're one with them. But only if you come to the full end, the full extent of this richness, this fullness of experience, then you will be able to step away from your own urge and look at what was really driving you. And usually when you come to that dead end, sometimes by just being born with it, sometimes by very bitter experiences, you will find that behind all that search that you were doing, that driving, that running, doing workshop courses, meditations, there was one urge for unity and freedom and love. And only if you come to that deep, 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 very painful experience that it's not out there, and that split moment that you think, where then is it? Then you will be able to return away from the cave that was outside of you, Plato's cave, and find the light within yourself. And from there, it will cast a light on everything that you do from that moment on. So that means there's another question coming up. What can we do for an exercise? There's no exercise. There's only life. And if you come to the dead end and you feel that you're urged to look for questions in yourself, then contemplate that. See what the voice of the silence brings about in yourself, because it will speak to you. Because what it does, it will cast a light on the back end of the wall of the cave, and you will see that there was a back end of the cave, and then you will feel the need to turn away from it. So that's the only practice. Look in yourself what light will be cast on your own actions, and you will know from within. The problem is with hearing a voice from within that we often think as if it should be something that you can actually hear, but it often also presents itself in ourselves as an inner knowing, just a knowledge that wells up from this fiery heart, and then you know what you have to do or not. To me, that's the way the inner voice works.
Cool, thank you. That ties in nicely with Deepa's question of, I was wondering how one can experience the spirit spark within oneself, either during meditation or in the entire day. Is it possible to experience and feel this spirit spark? Perhaps Neville, would you like to answer Deepa's question?
Once again, I repeat what Tanya said, is that it's got, yes, if we yearn for it. It's the yearning for it that really drives it and that brings a result, an astral result in the energy, so that we actually get to experience what we yearn for. So, it's like that law given to us: seek and you will find. Knock on the door and it will be answered. This is the law, and if we yearn to know the spirit spark and really sincerely give ourselves to that yearning, then it will show itself, possibly in surprising ways, but it still will show itself in some way. And it's not always a clear, audible voice within. It's often, as Tanya said, a knowing, or an inner impression, an intuition that presents itself in all different ways. But seek and you will find. Give our life to it, surrender to it, love it. Allow it to create some space and some silence in our heart so that it can be heard. Like this is the essence of that surrender, is to make some room for this other directedness within us, so that it can be heard or experienced consciously, and we can be guided by it.
I was going to add also about to say, like, you have to search until you find what resonates with you, but also through that labyrinth of life, or like labyrinth in our head, as Netta was having in the presentation, we need certain GPS navigation tool, and that navigation tool, that's something within us, and if we are paying attention to it, then we'll probably find sooner what we are looking for. And when we find what we are looking for, you will look like Gildo on our screen. The beach, if you're wondering. But for other people wondering, he is keeping all this going on with the multiple sites and social media. But he can give you a hint, how will that look like?
Yeah, and it's never choreographed or planned. It can happen at any point. You feel that, and you can't really explain what it is. And sometimes it's just for a second, and then you're back to the real life again. But it's just floating over you, and you're able to connect to it at some certain points. It's not necessarily sitting by yourself in a room, in the quietness of your room, that you can feel that connection. Sometimes it could be in the middle of, working, or in the middle of maybe speaking to a student who comes to see you. I work for a university. Or it could be like just walking down the street, crossing the street. You can have that connection at just that one moment, one fleeting moment, and it's there. So it's not something that you can plan on and say, okay, now I'm sitting here, I'm going to get that connection happening. So.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that we often get asked, is meditations, or is the practice of self-observation, from pupils of the school, something that you really need to make time for in your day? And obviously the question is, yes, you do need to, but it's not like, as Mari Rose said, you don't need to actually say, right, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to set myself in my room and make quiet. It's more an attitude. You can find it when you're taking the dog for a walk, or doing the dishes, or even vacuum cleaning the floor. It's when you turn your attention towards your inner self. And even though you may be in the world doing worldly everyday tasks, you don't necessarily have to be concentrating or attaching yourself to the pressures and the influences of the world. So you can actually connect to that silence and that stillness at a time when you are still being busy. And that's how you can live your pupilship, and live that connection to that spirit field day to day.
Nairi, can I dare saying something as well?
Absolutely.
You all said so many nice things, but that reminded me of the parable of the fish. That, the fish went to the wise fish in the sea, and they said, we've heard about the water. Please show us the water, right? And the fish looked at them and said, you are in the water. You're part of it, yearning to feel the presence of the spirit is the spirit feeling the yearning for itself through your heart. There's no separation. The separation is in our minds. We are water. We are the spirit. We are everything. And in the moment that we try to grasp it, we lose it. Is just like riding a bike. You know, somebody gives you a bike as a gift, and you ask, "How do I stand on it?" Ride it, because if you try to be on the top of the bike, to reach balance, and then to start riding it, you can't. And where is the balance of the bike? Is it in the bike? No, it's in you. So everything is in us. And the moment that we try to experience something or to grasp something, we start from the assumption that the object and us are two different things. And actually, there's only unity in the universe.
And that's why relaxation can be one of the most spiritual choices we can make in a way on this path. And it's interesting that the Gnostic path has also been called the path of the great rest, because there's an effortlessness in it. There's a non-doing in it, of letting go and, you know, detaching from outcome. And relax. Okay.
Relax and be exposed. Yeah. By light.
Okay, so we've got quite a lot of questions, and we're just trying to squeeze them into the last few minutes of our webinar. So they're all very useful and very appreciate your comments and your points of view. So just a couple more. One from Emram says, I noticed that as external silence decreases, the traffic of thoughts in our minds. When this happens, I further notice that some thoughts that entered my mind were not mine. Furthermore, twice I have received an answer during meditation. How do I control which question in my mind could be answered? Perhaps Milos, would you like to start with this?
I'm looking through a couple of questions. Can you please try to repeat one more time?
Okay, sure. I notice that external silence decreases the traffic of thoughts in our mind. And when this happens, I further notice that some thoughts that entered my mind were not mine. Furthermore, I noticed that I received an answer during meditation. How do I control which question in my mind should be answered?
Comes to mind that we did hear, we have many things going on around us. We don't want to blame on others for our own imprisonment. Just to clarify that, we are probably the ones with our own minds keeping us, so to speak, in prison. But there is a lot of subliminal messages. We are exposed to so many frequency vibrations around us. It will not be surprising that we are also a target of some like the advertisement. That's definitely part of it, but I think that our main focus is our own minds. If we try to clarify our own and to distinguish, then the others will fall in place. We always mention what are the results of those thoughts or actions that are based on the thoughts, or what is the fruit of the tree. If somebody tells you, oh, this is the apple tree, but you see peaches on it, which means we are seeing the results of those thoughts and where those thoughts and actions are leading to. And based on that, we can see what was the origin of the thoughts. Because all what we are talking here today is how we are going to apply in our daily life. Are we changing our behavior? Are we changing? We are thinking that maybe we achieved something by meditation or participation, but are we changing our attitude to life? Are we changing our behavior? Are we changing our actions? Which means we need to have that in balance in order that our own reality is changing based on our actions. At the end of the day is, what do you do? If you know something, but you don't do it, it's the same as you don't know it. Bottom line is what you're going to do with it. And then you will see the results of it. If I may add, comes to mind, Neto was using that example that projecting our thoughts is like having it in front of us. And these days, it's coming more and more popular that everybody will have certain virtual reality, right? Which means we are talking about being imprisoned in this realm, and now we are adding additional layer of virtuality. And now imagine having the virtual headset and seeing different reality. You're trying to distinguish what's going on there, and you are trying to put things in order. I think that we really need to step back and not have that attachment. As Neto was saying in presentation, we were able to create something, and by attachment, we become creation, not the creator. Our attachments, we emerged in these our own images, thoughts, and we are thinking that we are that, which means we really need to do some reverse engineering.
Nairi, if I may add just one last thought to what Milos just said to conclude. You know, the last part of the question was, how do I control the question? Well, the real question that you could ask yourself is, why am I being controlled by another question? So many times we don't pay attention to what is really driving us because we want to drive a different result within ourselves. But, you know, if our effort was in really knowing who we are or what is really driving us, as you said, I realized that some thoughts just came from outside of my head into my head. How? How did that happen? I mean, if we really used our energy not to try to regain control or to live in the illusion that we are in control of things, but instead, if we learned what controls us, then the level of control of those things in us would be reduced and a space of freedom would be created within ourselves.
Yeah, good, thanks, Neto. Well, we've run out of time to answer any other questions, except there's one that has popped up, which I think is notable to mention. And it is that, could we share this video with friends and family? The person said that they had a great, enjoyed listening to the webinar. And this is a public seminar, a public webinar. It has been recorded and it will be put on the school's social media channels at some time in the future. So yes, there is an option of when they are posted to keep in contact with, the web pages that we mentioned earlier, the Golden Rosycross community web page, the Golden Rosycross pages in your home country, and Facebook and media channels, YouTube channels. So you will have the option of being able to allow your friends and families to see this in an edited form when it is posted. Thank you all for your comments and your participation. It's been a great, international webinar. I hope that it has been something lasting that you can take with you for your spiritual path. We hope that we have answered your questions and that any interest you have in this topic has sparked something that you can draw on in the coming days. Please feel free to use the social media channels of the Golden Rosycross community to attend one of our upcoming events. if you want to know more about these topics and this activity in the world of the school. We will now take a break and be back at 12 o'clock Australian time, that is in 10 minutes, for our contemplative session. Please stay connected to this webinar link, as the contemplation will be under the same webinar ID. We'll see you shortly.